I think the thing that companies have to realize, this is not going to end. The U.S. feels in some ways aggrieved by both Chinese industrial practices, but also the fact that it has lost manufacturing, so kind of a double blow. On top of that, U.S. policy is now driving more towards, we wanted to either reshore to the U.S. or North America, or we want it out of Chinese influence. And so one of the things we're going to start to see is tariffs and other tools used extensively to try to force that. They want to force companies to come back to North America or the US, or even leave Chinese influence supply chains. The second thing we're going to see is some form of demand of traceability. We see, of course, with chips, right? Chips end up in Singapore, maybe they end up somewhere else, and so at some point these governments are going to say we want 100% traceability and verification. So when you're sourcing from Southeast Asia, there's a few things. The first is map your supply chain. Where is your stuff actually coming from? And usually companies will just do that so they have a piece of paper to show the customer. But these types of geopolitical tensions are only going to increase. So the customer will demand some form of full traceability. And the second really is understand the risk in your supply chain. So for example, if you're making a toy, there's probably not as much risk in your supply chain as if you're making some form of steel rods, right? And so kind of depending on, it's more industry based and also location based, but you have to understand those different dynamics. A toy producer will not get looked at as hard as a steel producer or somebody who produces parts from steel. You're right. I think part of the challenge is when people look at supply chains is they don't realize how much it costs to actually either change a supplier or make a product somewhere else. There's also a time factor. So for example, one of the things we've seen is large buyers, particularly in the US and Europe, they'll go to suppliers and say, we don't care where it's made from, but this is the price you're going to give us. And if you don't, then we'll go somewhere else. And one of the things we learned from the pandemic is a lot of companies and even governments want to have resiliency, but resiliency comes at a lot of cost. And so again, depending on the product and industry, you may be safe, you may not be safe. At the moment, one of the things we've seen is companies that do have several geographical locations. For example, China plus one or plus two. Right? I have a factory in China, I have one in Southeast Asia, maybe one in the Middle East or Mexico now. And customers like that because they can now order from different places, but it also gives them a sense that you are understanding the dynamics at work and effectively trying to address the problem. What customers, particularly in the US, do not want is they do not want to see suppliers who aren't actually addressing concerns. And so sometimes that just means, oh, we're working on a plan, right? Here's our plan of mitigation. It's really in some ways showing that you have actually planned out and thought about the process, right? It's not actually doing something, but that you've thought about it and planned it out. And finally, if you're particularly sourcing from Southeast Asia, it's also where else can you sell to besides the US and Europe? And I think really, when you look at the new markets open in the Middle East, Africa to some degree, and in the rest of the Americas, there's a lot of other places you can go and still make money. It may not be as much money, but the sourcing strategies out of Southeast Asia, now that they've shifted more from China, are not going to be here for at least the next 30 years. So one of the things for companies to think about is, sure, I'm selling toys to the US now, but in 5 or 10 years I may sell it to the Middle East or parts of Africa. So how does that actually look like? And again, thinking about that process and starting to plan that out because it's coming. Companies are really focused on privacy and efficiency, right? We want to make sure that our data is secure. We don't want to have any lawsuits against us, right? We don't want the government to come after us. So it's more of a cautious approach. Chinese firms often are more willing to risk adoption. And one of the benefits of a DeepSeek, as an example, is now it's much cheaper for companies to try. So one of the things that I've seen, particularly in the last couple of weeks, companies talk about is if they have AI programs. So for example, if you're a manufacturer, you have a whole bunch of production data, often decades worth, or you have quality data that's decades worth, or some other type of logistics data. And so now you can actually have smart programs that can take all of this data at the same time and analyze it for you. So for example, one of the projects I've seen that a company's working on is we have all this production data, we're putting it in the system, and now they're finding out, oh, this machine when it makes this material actually has a lot of problems. Or if we want to run this type of material, this machine and this technician on the machine is the best to do that. So they're finding really interesting nuances and aspects of the business where they can actually improve efficiency and operations. And so I think this is the area where we're going to start to see most improvement in the next 5 years. It's not that it's going to change and people will lose jobs. I think what it will do is it'll give us a lot more insight into the information, but also how to improve our overall business. I think part of the challenge is once you start to see your own deficiencies, right, your own challenges, now you're going to go to your supplier and say, why aren't you using this, right? And so it may be less initially about traceability, but it'll be more about driving efficiency, right? Because if you're finding challenges, particularly maybe with a certain type of raw material that comes into your factory, or maybe it's made on this type of machine, then you're going to go to the raw material producer and say, do you know this is what's happening to the material? Or you're going to go to the machine maker and say, do you realize that the machine is affecting it this way? And so now it's going to drive more efficiency in the supply chain. So initially it'll be less about traceability, but it will be more about efficiency. But to your point, I think within a few years, maybe 5 years, because you'll have all of that data, you'll be able to see trends, and if things are off, you'll be able to spot them easier, right? So for example, when you look at traceability, when you have material that comes in, if you have this kind of smart system and you're starting to have problems, then you can actually quarantine the material and take a better look at it. Whereas now sometimes you'll make a whole batch of products and you realize, oh, the product isn't good. So these are some of the things we're going to see. So does it help traceability out specifically? Not immediately, but over time we'll start to see that.